This is the Aware Families Podcast, the show that brings you a science-based, practical look at how to use the principles of functional medicine to keep your family healthy. Welcome back to the Aware Families Podcast. It is mid-July here in the Flathead Valley.
Yep.
Summer's in full swing.
Full swing, hot. Today is going to be one of those first hot days.
Mm-hmm. And tomorrow's going to be in like low to mid 90s. And
Love it.
True to form, that's also every year the Logan Health Fitness Center puts on that kids triathlon.
Is that this weekend?
It's this weekend.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep. And so we missed last year because we were out of town, but they're doing it again this year. And so they kind of gauge it by age, but they have like the pool out there by Woodland.
Yes.
And so then there's a swim part of it. There's a bike. They have a bike track, and then the run part of it.
Awesome.
And so it's pretty cool to get kids into it and just kind of get them in a little bit more of that fitness mindset. And so it's really good. It's growing every year, so it's a really cool thing.
Love it. Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, and then today, so we're kind of going to talk about, we're going to shift gears a little bit.
As we always do.
As we always do, right. We like to kind of cover a wide variety of
do
topics.
Stuff like babies, and now we're going to kind of go to the other end of the spectrum.
Yes. So Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, and our functional approach to this.
Yeah, which is a huge topic, very apropos, very on a lot of people's minds, both just from the media and also what everybody, people are experiencing in their own family members, or, and it's everybody's affected by this somehow.
Exactly. And we'll kind of get into some of the statistics here too, but maybe just to start, we should just talk about like what mild to cognitive decline is. And, I'm guessing most people have heard the term Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. I feel like that term has kind of been around. And then, mild cognitive decline that we talk about kind of in like the clinical setting or whatever might not be the same terminology used out in the public.
Yeah, there's kind of a spectrum, right? There's
a little bit, yep.
Because there's which is also kind of controversial, right? There's the age-related cognitive decline that's sort of like, as they say, that's expected. But I'm like, I don't know if that's necessarily right.
And it's funny because, so Bredesen, Dr. Bredesen, he talks about why are we expecting any of this? Yeah. Right? Should we change our terminology and should we kind of
It's sort of like them changing the labs for your liver enzymes because everybody's got fatty liver. 100 million Americans have fatty liver.
So all of a sudden the new normal is a lot higher.
Yeah, so if the new normal is like cognitive decline, I mean, that might be the new normal, but that doesn't mean it's truly normal or good.
Right.
So, but there is, and obviously everybody jokes about their senior moments, right?
Right.
But quietly inside, they're like,
oh, shoot.
Yeah, they're scared poopless because is this for early sign?
You and I talk about this a lot when I talk about hormones, right? Perimenopause and menopause. I mean, same thing. I've joked about it with you in our office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
obviously, cognitive decline, neurodegenerative disease, which includes Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, something called Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, are no joke.
Right. Not at all.
So maybe we actually, should we just hit the stats real quick?
Yeah,
Just
let's do.
How many people are actually affected. And it's funny because we actually I had a slide from a couple of years ago from Alzheimer's Association, and then I just printed out their new one. And
it's a lot different.
It's different and horrifyingly, like the numbers are going up.
Let's make sure we cover both because this is kind of interesting on the jump, right? Mm-hmm. So this data that I'm going to say is from 2018, and you're going to speak real quick on 2025.
Yep.
Okay, so 2018, 50 million people worldwide were affected, and 5.7 million Americans were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
And so the newer ones, 7 million Americans are currently living with Alzheimer's.
That's a big jump.
A big jump.
And that's 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the other big stats that they had mentioned at that time was 45 million Americans have preclinical, so Alzheimer's disease, and will go on to develop Alzheimer's disease in their lifetime.
Yeah, and they actually, on this one, they don't have that pre-Alzheimer's kind of stat, but I mean, if you sort of extrapolate, it's got to be... it's got to be upwards, because what was that, 45? I mean, it's got to be upwards of like 50 million or something like that, which those numbers are staggering.
Right, yeah.
And so 1 in 3, the new data, 1 in 3 older adults dies with Alzheimer's or another dementia.
Yeah, which is kind of wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have that it, kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined.
Yep. Yeah, and that's kind of been a consistent thing, but yet it doesn't seem like
maybe the attention isn't there.
Well, is like a killer, because it's really, this also goes to the whole quantity of life, quality of life thing.
Totally.
And having seen this firsthand with family members, it's that's what you really, it's that loss of quality, the loss of the person, essentially, their personality and everything like that is I think more devastating than a fatal illness in some ways.
Yeah, because you kind of go through grief twice, right? Because you have that whole grief experience when you lose the person that you knew, right? And then all of a sudden, and then when they do finally pass away, you have that grief again. Yeah. So, I mean, it's devastating.
Although they say since the last stuff, they said the deaths from Alzheimer's have actually increased 142%. Heart disease is relatively steady. The deaths there may be down just a slight trickle. And the financial costs of caring for people with dementia is also unsustainably staggering.
Exactly, because most of these folks are not able to stay at home. Yeah. Right. And so they're not going to be at home. They're not even going to be with a caregiver at home. They're going to be in some kind of an assisted living or full assist facility. And those are expensive. Mm-hmm.
So direct costs, $385 billion. And then they're projecting by 2050, it could be $1 trillion.
Wow.
I mean,
that's staggering.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. For sure.
And so obviously again, almost everybody is somehow impacted by this. Knows somebody. So the numbers are huge.
Yeah. For sure.
And so this is affecting. But we should go through and sort of what is Alzheimer's? We'll define, I think like Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment versus a normal aging brain.
Mm-hmm, right. And how, there's some certain signs and symptoms that we see, but, it's been really a clinical diagnosis is what we've seen over time. Only now we're starting, and we'll get to that, where we have more diagnostic studies and different lab tests that we can use for this. But mild cognitive impairment, we can start with kind of like that just decreased sharpness or decreased like just ability for that recall. So that memory starting to have to rely on more tools, right? So like your
sheets,
your sticky notes, your phone, the calendar on your phone, your others in your house, right? Your significant others. Speaking, you might find losing words. Brief calculations are things that you used to do in your head, right?
It's a little bit slower.
Yep, right. Planning, all of a sudden, things that we used to do where we would maybe plan a big event actually are a trial.
A struggle, yeah. And it's hard because this is, again, it's a spectrum and it's subjective.
Exactly.
And there can be certainly temporary factors, stress, sleep, all these things that can affect these things. But
hormones being off. I mean, truly, that is, it's definitely a thing here.
But it's, I also think like you don't want to blow things off either.
Right.
And then what about the progression from MCI, mild cognitive impairment, to early clinical Alzheimer's?
Right, where we start seeing like actually a decreasing mental clarity, right? We can start having a term that was called sundowning, where we have real changes to personality as the day goes, right? So towards dinner time, evening time. Yeah. And there's a lot of information out there and a lot of speculation on, what the sunlight and what the, just the time of day does for that.
And it's almost like the brain wattage just, can't hold up, and just over the
like we did so well this morning and the afternoon that by the evening everything is,
Yes.
Again, increased struggles with recall, so past events, past details, things like that. Having a difficulty reading, like following a plot line of a story or of a novel.
Whether that's a book or a
newspaper,
a TV show.
Yeah, or watching something. Yeah. How about decreased ability to recognize people? Right, and I think
facial blindness,
yeah,
facial blindness is they say is one of the big early potential signs,
right? Yeah, which is so scary.
Which is different than like forgetting names, because sometimes that's just like some people are much better, have a skill set of remembering names, but they're like, I don't remember names, but I always remember a face. But if it's like all of a sudden somebody's like not recognizing people that they should know,
right?
Then that may be, not always, but that's certainly one of those things on the list that could be a warning sign.
Oh, for sure. How about, I don't remember names very well, but I can remember like your entire lipid panel. If I saw you, I remember your labs like nothing. It's crazy. Okay, decreased vocabulary, decreased processing speed, so things just take a little bit longer. getting lost. Like, hey, I'm driving to the grocery store and I have no idea where I'm at now and I don't know how to get home.
Yeah.
You know, I had a lot of people that would come to me with that. Like, I'm in the car and I all of a sudden don't know where I'm at anymore.
In a place that they should.
Exactly.
You know?
In a place they lived forever.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Forgetting tasks, forgetting appointments, forgetting, you know, that you're going to do something for somebody else. Those are other things. And then that sleep disruption, like not being able to sleep, not having consistent sleep, waking up multiple times.
And also another thing that I hear about, and I think they talk about out there, is like people will start repeating themselves a lot or asking the same question a number of times. And we're like, we just talked about that like 5 minutes ago. And so that's that memory consolidation and that memory processing and storing.
Totally.
There's something interrupting that pathway. So that can be kind of a big one as well.
Oh, for sure.
You know, so as far as like the, you know, really quick, just the different types of dementias, there's sort of physical things that are different with these, although a lot of the symptoms can end up being the same versus, you know, and Parkinson's is kind of a separate thing where there's much more motor issues, like muscle issues. But with Alzheimer's so Alzheimer's basically is you build up these sort of like this junk in your brain. There's something called beta amyloid and another one called tau protein. And so you will get these tangles and these plaques in the brain from these different proteins, the sort of protein metabolites. And that's kind of what they think kind of causes the later stages of it, although Bredesen has a different view on that, like where it's like, because all the medications that have come out targeting those proteins have been abysmal failures. And so we think like, is this actually an attempt at the brain to protect itself from other insults?
Because they're always there.
And so is it a causative thing, or is it more of a sign and symptom of other things that are going on? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes too.
Exactly, because they're continuing to come in to protect.
Versus what's called vascular dementia, where you don't get enough blood flow to your brain, so you're not getting the right nutrients, you're not getting the glucose, the oxygen, things like that. And there's overlaps with these things. So you know they're very commonly is a vascular component where there's blood vessels, you're not getting that nutrient delivery. But there's also all these other kind of components that are consistent with Alzheimer's. So it is also possible to have a blend. And then Lewy body, you have these different clumps of proteins called alpha synuclein. I think I pronounced that correctly. And that hits different parts of your brain where there's a lot more. So you get the dementia part of it, but you also get a lot more personality changes. And I know this one can be particularly tough for people because early on there's some abrupt personality changes that can be associated.
Right.
And then again, there's kind of these mixed pathologies and stuff like that. I think Parkinson's will probably do it as a whole separate one because there's some interesting stuff with Parkinson's and toxic exposures, increasing the risk and things like that.
Right.
So should we talk about what do you want to hit? Who's at risk?
I was just going to say, maybe we kind of jump into like the who's at risk and then start talking about, you know, what happens to the brain during the process, kind of go there, and then we can start looking at some of like the screening and diagnostics. I know you kind of did a deep dive here, so this will be an interesting discussion. But so how do people know if they're at risk? Like, what are, you know, we all have a brain.
So I know I was going to say that. That's the Bredesen quote from, I remember because I saw him actually before his book came out.
And he has a couple now.
Yeah, it's a couple. It was before the original, end of Alzheimer's book. Okay. And he actually gave this talk at this metabolic health symposium that I was at in Seattle. It was like an amazing conference. And so like Robert Lustig was there, David Ludwig, and I think he was one of the keynote guys. And I think the title of his talk was either pediatric Alzheimer's, no, I'm not kidding, or pediatric gerontology, no, I'm not kidding, something along those lines. Like people are like, what? You know, basically that these processes start early on in life. So
I mean, that's the big piece there.
Yep. And we're definitely going to hit that a lot today. But he's like, if you have a brain, you're at risk. Yeah, you know. So obviously, there's nothing that's going to sort of exonerate you from risk of developing some type of dementia. But that being said, what are some of the other things?
Some of the things we're going to look for right away. You know, if you have a first degree relative with Alzheimer's disease, it might be we're going to need to be paying extra close attention, which again, we covered this right away in the beginning too. Most of us do.
Yeah.
So again, right there puts most of us in this category. There's some certain lab tests we can do, ApoE4, right? If we have 1 or 2 copies of that.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So ApoE4 is, they call it the Alzheimer's gene, which I think kind of does it a disservice.
I agree. It kind of puts it into this whole negative connotation, like just from the get-go.
Even though, doesn't have to be. I think we have a separate slide on that, but so you can either have 1 or 2 copies. So you have this ApoE gene, there's like these 3 variants, like a 2, 3, and a 4. And then a 3 is neutral. The 4 is kind of like associated more with increased risk of Alzheimer's. The 2 is protective. So if you had like a 4 and a 2, they kind of cancel each other out a little bit.
Right. But if you have two
4s, that's I think it's like 50%.
It's about 50% is what the new data was showing. Yeah.
So it definitely increases your risk, but
only 50%.
Yeah, so
we're going to keep this positive spin here.
Yeah. It's not but it has been treated as such in the past, and so the people were like advised not to get this checked. And I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't, but the big argument against getting your genetics checked for this is like, oh, that's a death sentence, or it means then you get this fatalistic attitude. But both Richard Isaacson, who's a researcher, started the nation's first Alzheimer's prevention clinic at Cornell Weill in New York City. Dale Bredesen from the other coast, from all the stuff he did at UCLA, and in the California system. He would also have these sort of Bredesen clinics. Like, there is a lot we could do to either slow or potentially even halt, or maybe in some cases even reverse the process.
Right.
But it was, that was just not accepted until recently. It's starting to be acknowledged, like, oh, maybe we can. So that, and maybe things are different for if you carry the ApoE4 than if you don't carry the ApoE4, which I think is the case. So we're not saying do or don't get this checked, but if you do get it checked, it's not the be all end all. Like the DNA is not your destiny. There's a lot of other things involved.
Epigenetics and all of that. I think one thing that we kind of covered that we actually didn't cover on the podcast yet, now that I think about it, was just having the discussion with your provider, right? So that you really know and you understand, if you're doing genetic testing, like, what is it you're actually getting and what happens if you have a positive genetic test. Because there is a lot of, there's a lot of discussion points that should be happening, and there's a lot of thought that goes into it. So just kind of knowing that.
Like we were saying, is it going to affect my health insurance, life insurance? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also just that, are you the type of person that's going to take that fatalistic, and perseverate on it, like, I'm done for, versus being empowered, being like, well, all right, I'm game on. I'm going to do everything I can.
Exactly. And they have genetic counselors that are amazing. I mean, we have Pallister Genetics up here now, and then we have a group through Logan Health as well, that honestly, what a great idea to be able to go and just have those discussions with folks. You and I do this a lot here at Functional Medicine Associates, so there's a lot of opportunity to have a discussion with somebody who has knowledge about it.
Yep. Yeah. And then there is the other gene, the PSEN or presenilin gene that is I'd say a bit more serious than the ApoE4, because it is strongly associated with early onset cognitive decline and Alzheimer's.
Right.
But again, if you have a strong family history of very early onset, something to consider. But again, I would talk with your primary, consider talking to a genetic counselor. And
when we say early onset, we're talking late 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah,
I mean, really
significant decline by the age of 50. Yeah.
Okay, so then women, unfortunately, we have 2 times the risk. It just, again, the benefit of being a female.
2/3 of Alzheimer's cases are women.
Yep. Physical inactivity. You and I cover this over and over and over on how important it is to move your body.
And both, right?
Yeah.
Cardio and strength training.
Strength training. You need both.
We'll talk about this towards the end of the podcast, but we'll hammer that point home. Boy, that inactivity it's a killer in so many ways.
Right. How about academic achievement, cognitive engagement, or lack of?
Keeping that brain active.
You gotta learn something, right? I mean, that's honestly kind of what it comes down to. There's all these brain teasers and things like that, but I think one of the biggest things is you need to learn something new all the time. You need to keep your brain engaged.
Neuroplasticity.
Yep. So continue to learn stuff. And if it's like, maybe it's learning puzzles, learning how to quilt, learning how to paint, learning a new language, right?
Musical instrument.
Yeah, you can do this when you're 70, 80.
Yep.
Like these are all things. We know the risks of type 2 diabetes, obesity.
And we'll talk about this when we talk about the sort of the subtypes of Alzheimer's, per kind of the Bredesen thought process.
Okay.
But that type 2 diabetes, that's the one he calls the sweet Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And not because it's sweet to have it, but because that sugar is a big risk factor.
It's putting gas on the fire.
Yep.
Smoking, alcohol use, vitamin D deficiency.
Yeah, alcohol, especially with ApoE4 carriers, I guess, is, there's been some evidence that it's especially detrimental.
Right. Okay. And vitamin D deficiency, you and I talk a lot about vitamin D deficiency. And so this is a risk factor.
Yeah.
How about just the standard American diet?
Yeah.
Right.
Risk factor for just about everything,
right?
But especially for Alzheimer's and cognitive decline.
Yeah. And then again, a brain.
and we'll talk about, when we talk about some of this, we'll rattle through some of the testing things that we do, especially as we look at some of these kind of subtypes of Alzheimer's, other ways of kind of telling if you're at risk. There's other ways of looking at, like, chronic inflammation. How are you on that pre-diabetes to diabetes pathway? All these other things. So, I think beyond like the things that we just talked about in the genetics, I think there are other biomarkers that we use a ton in functional medicine. And I think, again, if you're acting upstream, if you're acting proactively, then these things can be a real turning point to be like, okay, now the enemy. Now this is going on. What do we do to act upstream and right the ship?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so do you want to talk a little bit about what happens to the brain during the process of Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but the so there's the thought process now, I think, especially from reading Bredesen's work, is that there's some kind of insult to the brain, and that the end result of that ends up being that you get these neurofibrillary tangles and this amyloid plaque build up in the brain, which you can actually, as we'll talk about some of the screening stuff, you can actually see it on certain imaging modalities, and you can also now test for. You can test it in a lumbar puncture or in your CSF, your cerebrospinal fluid, but now there's some new blood tests that will come out that's really kind of intriguing, where you can check for some of these things, markers in the blood. But again, I think these things are. It definitely is part and parcel of Alzheimer's, but why are you building up these plaques and these tangles? I think that's the $1 million question, and it's not probably the same for everybody. And in fact, we know it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah, we know it's not the same.
So I think that's sort of like the sort of subtypes of Alzheimer's that we talk about there. So what are the sort of 3 or 4 subtypes of Alzheimer's that he talks about in the book? Right.
So he's got the kind of like hot, or the inflammatory infectious type.
Yep.
Right? The cold, or kind of like the atrophic postmenopausal, lack of supportive factors type.
Yeah, which can be everything from like estrogen, vitamins, other nutritional factors that are not getting there. So then the brain just kind of involutes.
Wants to be like, all right, I'm taking a nap. Yeah. And then that mixed sweet type.
Yep.
Which is, you briefly mentioned that too, where we're starting to talk about like increased sugars, increased insulin.
And you'll hear this actually mentioned now in the medical literature, the type 3 diabetes thing, which at first was kind of like, what? Kind of the side eye, but that there's this recognition of the overlap and with the number of Americans with type 2 diabetes, and you can see why the numbers are jumping up with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things I think too is that the toxic, which kind of feeds into some of these other ones, but I think he actually might mention it as like a whole separate.
I was going to say this new book that he's written that I don't know how new it is for sure, but The Ageless Brain.
I haven't read that one yet.
Okay, it's phenomenal, by the way. He is kind of diving into like this toxic piece of it, right? Which is like,
and we always talk about in functional medicine, like we are not living in the same environment that we were,
60 years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Yeah, certainly not a couple hundred years ago.
Right. Well, and I mean noise. So like he's covering noise right now. I mean, in this book, he's chatted a lot about noise. Like the noise exposure that we have as humans now is nothing like what it was 60 years ago, 100 years ago. Like, think about it. Noise pollution from people, right? Cars, traffic, being in a grocery store.
On top of air pollution, water pollution.
But like
toxic
nature
food
doesn't
supply.
have that much noise.
No.
You know, and so when you start looking at decibels and that cortisol response that goes from it, like it's a big deal. And then, yeah, you jump into what you're talking about.
And that interesting link on
mycotoxins.
that is like there's also a huge link with hearing loss
Yes.
and acceleration of cognitive
Yes.
decline and dementia, Alzheimer's.
Yep. See?
And so that whatever that correlation, probably because it's if you lose that other important stimuli, you know, which also feeds into that. I can't remember the name of that documentary where they had the people with really severe Alzheimer's, and then they played them music from their past, and all of a sudden they like came alive, and like it was like some nonverbal people would become like at least transiently verbal, or they like started dancing. Like this one lady had been a dancer when she was younger, and they played like the stuff that she used to do in the ballet or whatever, and all of a sudden it was amazing, like music therapy.
Yeah.
And so there's that power of sound.
See?
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
So really cool. But the toxic thing, you know, so it could be air, food, water, you know, biotoxins. So things they're looking at stuff like mold.
I was just going to say molds, heavy metals, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
are all things that, again, I think is finally
unfortunately.
starting to get a little bit more recognized in the Western medical. It's sort of got marginalized for so long, but there's a whole field called environmental medicine that is, you know, this is the real deal.
Right.
Like we are getting poisoned by our environment, and denying it isn't helping anything.
Yeah, you look about, you know, places in the U.S. that have high lead in their water and all these
arsenic, mercury,
and all these, you know, impacts on the brain. I mean, it's the same thing. Like if it's happening now to everybody, in 20 years from now, if you had it for 20 years, what's going to happen?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. So.
So we already talked about the role of ApoE4.
So we're kind of in like, well, what do we do?
Although the interesting thing, so just real quick, I guess, to go back on some of these things. So I just wanted to define a couple things. So there's something called oxidative stress that we talk about a lot in functional medicine, and I should just probably define that really quick. And so oxidative stress, basically, because we get exposed to all these toxins, and you know, I need to say toxins and toxicants. So just toxicant is something that's produced outside the body. A toxin is usually something that's produced by either our own body, like a biotoxin, or some other organism like a mold or something like that. So toxins and toxicants. But basically what end result of all that is this stuff called oxidative stress, where you have these natural sort of antioxidant detoxification pathways in our bodies. We're designed, but they can get easily overwhelmed. You know, I call it the multi-hit hypothesis, you know, where we're just getting saturated from all these things. And then the end result is like they start to damage our tissues. And that's sort of usually referred to as oxidative stress. That these things, because they're not, that these little sort of fires are not getting quenched, and then they damage the tissues. And you can actually measure levels of oxidative stress by looking at inflammatory markers and some other things that we check in functional medicine pretty frequently. And you can actually measure damaged DNA. It's called a 8-hydroxy DG, you know, which is basically like a oxidized part of your DNA that you can measure in blood, and the higher the oxidative stress, the higher that test comes up. So, you know, high oxidative stress definitely linked in with all kinds of brain issues, but especially you know, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, things like that. So,
and we have like testing we can do for oxidative stress. I mean, that's something we can do here.
Yep. So, so when we talk about some of the risk factors, you know, that's one of the end results of a lot of either infection or inflammation. Can be these type of things. You know, and then I think like going back to the metabolic component of it too.
Yeah.
So it's not just having high blood sugar, which is almost like an oxidative stress in and of itself.
Right.
But having high insulin levels is also a risk factor for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's.
Exactly. So it's not, so high blood sugar, people can relate to this, right? Like determining pre-diabetes. So insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, diabetes, right? But then high insulin levels that your pancreas is releasing to deal with blood sugars. You can actually have high insulin levels a lot. And normal blood sugars because your pancreas is working
overtime
until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't. But
and so,
all that while there's damage going on with the body. So interestingly, and I think he talks about this in the book, where insulin resistance, which is basically the diabetes on-ramp, where your body's cranking out the insulin, your blood sugars aren't too bad yet, you know, they're kind of being held, but that high insulin level in the body, so it decreases the activity of the part of your body that normally just sort of degrades the insulin, which also degrades amyloid beta, which is one of the main kind of the plaquey stuff that builds up in your brain. So that's a direct link with insulin resistance and sort of poor metabolic health and that buildup of the brain stuff that ends up, sort of causing or at least being strongly associated with Alzheimer's. And then same thing with tau. It increases the sort of pathogenicity or like the ability of that tau protein to cause issues. High insulin does. And then the brain too, like if your brain is insulin resistant, it can't metabolize the glucose that well. And we know from like these special things called PET scans that the brains of Alzheimer's patients, they don't metabolize glucose the same. There's like this metabolic impairment. So your mitochondria, those vital things that we always talk about in functional medicine, that they're not working well either, which is, I think both a warning sign, but also a route for like, how do we tune those mitochondria up to slow the process? So it's really, there's so many things feeding into it, which is why I think Bredesen says like, if you have 34 holes in your roof and it's raining, and you plug 2 or 3 of the holes, are you still going to get wet? So you need to figure out what the holes in your brain roof are, in order to try to plug the holes and fix the leak.
Right. And like we've said from the very beginning of our podcast, this is multifactorial.
Yeah.
So this is not just like what you just said, it's not one thing. You're not going to do one thing and fix everything. There's a lot of components here. And again, we don't have to feel like bad about this. Like these are all just things that we can work on and work towards, getting healthier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly too, the microbiome.
Well,
and everything.
So microbiome is huge, and actually there's a big component of that in his newest book, like I said, The Ageless Brain.
I was wondering how much you went into that in the new one.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the gut. So the gut microbiome we talk about a ton because functional medicine is all about the gut and all disease starting in the gut.
Everything starts in the gut.
So if you have some of these bad bacteria in your gut, and leaky gut especially, there's definitely a big link in with this leaky gut, which the fancy name is called endotoxemia, meaning your gut is letting junk into your bloodstream that it should not.
Yeah.
And this junk, your body doesn't like it, and it mounts a huge inflammatory response. And you can actually measure this now too, like this something called LPS. But the stuff leaking through, and that type of inflammation from that endotoxemia strongly linked in with cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. And so bad gut bacteria can cause that leaky gut, as well as some of those toxic metabolites. And then, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the oral microbiome.
Yes.
Big link.
Huge. And not recognized, right? So if you have a good functional dentist, which there's a couple here in the valley. And just a
dentist who's, don't have to officially necessarily be dubbed, but somebody who is aware of that, and I've talked to some of the local dentists here, and they're definitely aware of it. And they had came out a few years ago, a study where they, post-mortem, they did autopsies on some Alzheimer's patients, and they found the same bacteria that causes gingivitis, like gum inflammation, they found it lodged in the brain with like this huge inflammatory process going on.
Yeah. Well, if it causes inflammation here, why wouldn't it cause inflation there? Do you know what I mean?
And it's all real close, so they're literally theorizing that, especially when it gets really deep down into like the root, that it can cross what's called the cribriform plate, or it can cross into the brain, past that blood-brain barrier, and then cause that huge issue. So never underestimate the power of a good dentist to help you.
And oral care. Brush your teeth, floss your teeth.
Yeah, flossing, they say, is probably even more important than brushing in some ways, although both are important.
Right, but floss every single day, and it's really not hard.
And you can, now there's these places where you can get oral microbiome testing and find out if you have a lot of these bad bacteria. And so I think it's like a
lot of dentists are doing this.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that our dentist in Columbia Falls at Three Rivers Dental is doing this.
Yeah,
now.
there's two of them, because there's one we can order through Rupa. I'm spacing on the name. I can't remember. I think I wrote it down somewhere. But then I know Viome also does one. Yeah. And they're not crazy expensive, but I think it's like, this is really interesting.
It's super interesting, right? And like, think about it. Every time you eat something, right, it passes through your mouth. Before it goes through, your down your esophagus into your gut. Yeah. Like, it's going in your mouth. Yep. And then how many of us, to be real, are brushing our teeth right away after we eat? Yeah. Not many.
Twice a day.
Twice a day.
For sure.
Yeah. If you have Invisalign, you might be doing it more. Or at least you're supposed to.
Yeah. Hopefully it prompts the people there to be a little more proactive about that. But yeah, so, both oral microbiome, gut microbiome, definitely worth paying attention to.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we kind of talked a little bit about like screening for risk factors, right? So like what kind of screening is it that we're talking about? I mean, you and I do a bunch of labs here at Functional Medicine Associates. A lot of, primary care providers are doing some similar labs. We talked a lot about those risk factors at the beginning, but I think now it kind of is a good time to jump into some of the labs that we might actually check.
Yeah. So I think there's sort of the functional testing that we'll talk about in a minute, which is more like your cognitive screening assessment.
I think that's a little deeper. Yeah, totally.
Which is, I think, if you're somebody who's concerned, like, am I showing early signs?
Right.
There's now there's more than ever before things you can do. There's these initial, like this thing called the MOCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, that's used quite a bit, and a host of other ones, an electronic.
I was going to say, and there's a lot online. Mm-hmm. So now that is one of the big changes I would say in the last decade is they've really made this like first pass screening available online for free.
So it doesn't have to be administered by a provider.
To at least have a worry.
Yes, you want to be plugged in with somebody to help interpret results or whatever,
or you do it at home and you screen and you recognize, ooh, shoot, then you go in.
Yep,
right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's kind of the nice thing about some of the stuff that now is available.
And then the sort of the next level, if you're actually screening for, do you have the brain changes associated? So for years they've had this test called an amyloid PET or positron emitted. What's the T?
I don't know. Don't remember.
That's why I call it PET scan. But it's pretty costly. But basically, it's using kind of this specialized imaging to light up if the brain has an amyloid buildup. Like basically, it kind of shows a different color on the PET scan, and it can show also what areas of the brain are active or not, and the glucose uptake by the brain. And so it can, some of these PET scans can show that, your brain is not utilizing glucose that well, but also you have a significant buildup of amyloid in there. Right. But again, it's kind of, it's costly. It's, and it's not to say it doesn't have some validity to it or whatever. And then the other thing they had for several years, but people weren't exactly chomping at the bit to get it, was what's called a lumbar puncture. Where they could put a little needle into your spinal and draw out spinal fluid, and they could check for some of these proteins in there. Yeah. But as of May this year, they just FDA cleared this test. It's now available for use. Called there's I think 2 out there, but I think it's called a Lumipulse. And basically they can check the levels of this tau protein, and then also a type of the beta amyloid, like the 2 main proteins that you kind of build up that gunk in your brain. Right. You can now check for those levels and ratios in the blood, and it supposedly has like a 90+% what's called a sensitivity and specificity, and a very high,
which is super high. Yeah. Like in our world, like when we have something that's 96, 97, 98%,
this isn't like a 50-50. Yeah, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Like, and then they say if you screen positive on that, then you do want to do imaging and maybe some of the next level kind of testing from there. Right. And it's got a strong negative predictive value. So if that test is normal or low, it's pretty good that you don't have a significant buildup of the Alzheimer's junk in your brain. Right. So
that's impressive.
And it's not crazy expensive from what I've get. And again, it just was released, and I was trying to look this up.
Yeah, you said that.
I think it was like $300 to $400, something like that. So versus some of the other tests they had were thousands and may not be covered by insurance.
And a PET scan or an MRI looking for volume, right? Those are pricey because they're imaging.
So again, this is new. So I actually looked on LabCorp, and you can order that through them. So I'm assuming then it is ready for prime time. I don't want to be slammed by other neurologists or whatever out there, but I've read through the couple papers and the FDA approval letter and everything like that. So it seems like this is another potential early screening factor to tell if this is early Alzheimer's, if some of the changes are going on. Right. So if it allows you to act more proactively, especially with everything we're talking about, to try to slow the decline, maybe even possibly reverse it, which was verboten for a long time. But Bredesen has published some case series where he's reversed some cognitive decline with people using some of these protocols we're talking about. So.
Right, for sure.
So that's kind of like that part of it, right? And then there's also the sort of the functional medicine part of it, which is what are the other the risk factors when we talk about the hot, cold, toxic, and sweet.
Right. And that's where we start looking at, might do some labs to start, right? Like even some labs that we would just do through the clinic, MTHFR, genetic changes, homocysteine levels, B12 levels, vitamin D levels, like all of these kind of things
important nutrients.
Yeah. But we're checking all the time, right? Really looking at a lipid profile and looking at like the specifics, your triglyceride level, your hemoglobin A1C,
your fasting insulin.
Right? That we check here. Some inflammatory markers like the HSCRP.
And then there's some other inflammatory markers too that can be checked. They don't always have to be, but I think that HSCRP, high sensitivity CRP, is a great, like a inexpensive marker of like there's some. We don't know exactly what's causing it, but let's look into this. But
let's keep looking, for sure. Your omega-3 fatty acid index. Like there's some, and those are all things that we can do. Then you can jump into some of the stuff you kind of mentioned earlier, right, where we're looking at like heavy metals and molds, mycotoxins, environmental toxins, right?
Yep.
And those are all things.
And then the cold ones, especially perimenopausal, postmenopausal, is that, definitely a big area for you, is checking hormone levels.
Yep. Right.
And then what, this has always been controversial too, but like the data with HRT and cognitive decline, I'm not super up on that.
Yeah. I mean,
Bredesen talks about it a little bit, but maybe he does more in the new book.
And the hard thing too, well, I haven't gotten to that part yet if he has. But the hard thing with HRT is, there can still be risk factors with it. So timing is kind of critical here.
Yeah.
You don't want to wait until we're 75 to have these discussions. Like this is something that should be done if we're looking at HRT, because, we have insulin receptors in our brain, right? So if we're looking at that, we need to be doing it within 10 years of menopause. And so that can be prior, at perimenopause. I have a lot of people that we start talking about HRT then and can start utilizing it. But we don't really want to be starting it outside of that 10-year mark.
Yeah,
the risk factors for cardiac and other, issues go way high. So that is one piece.
And we really only like checking things that are actionable, right? If we get a result that we can then recommend, like, okay, we're going to shift your diet, or we're going to look for some source of this inflammation. Do you have an occult infection? Is your horrible oral microbiome driving the high inflammatory marker? Other things like that. So not just like willy-nilly, we check this, I don't know what it means,
Correct.
Good luck.
Yeah, that's not what we're going to do. This
is all about like a targeted, personalized approach.
Right, N of one.
Yeah, because somebody, there's could be all these different roads that lead to Alzheimer's, but your road is different than somebody else's road, and so that's the advantage of doing, if you're worried about it, is doing some of these things that you can take action on.
Right, you can make a difference. And then like I said, shoring up that foundation, right? That's the 6 pillars, jumping in on like, hey, what are we missing here with this like
the sleep thing,
foundational impact?
Because sleep is because it kind of is a bad thing, because like the cognitive decline, Alzheimer's can sort of cause sleep issues, but sleep issues can actually accelerate cognitive decline.
Yeah, no, it's a double-edged sword.
But sleep apnea, like undiagnosed sleep apnea, I was reading in one of his case series, several of his patients had undiagnosed sleep apnea, and once they fixed that, the amount of improvement was significant.
Right. Well, because if you're sleeping and you're like, I'm sleeping all night long and I wake up exhausted, and you're getting 7-8 hours, we got to look at things, right? And there's different...
If you're falling asleep during the day, every time you stop moving.
Every time you sit down in the car, right? Or just straight up waking up exhausted.
Yep.
I mean,
and that kind of chronic low-grade headache.
Totally.
Like, why do I have a headache? And it's...
Right?
There's home testing that we utilize quite a bit. I think sleep centers are great doing a sleep study, but if there's any inkling that there's sleep issues, get tested, or come in and we can kind of talk about that kind of stuff, because it's so unbelievably important.
Right. And we are about out of time, so I think we need to catch our last little comments on it before we wrap up.
Well, let's talk about the exercise piece again.
Yep. Let's do it, because we have like 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so exercise. We hit on this in the very beginning. It's not just aerobic. It's also strength-based training.
Yes, and it's both from the standpoint, it helps those mitochondria, it helps your glucose metabolism and your overall energy metabolism of your brain. But the weight training, I always figured kind of like overall, like some kind of strength training type of thing will probably does more overall for boosting your metabolism because you have muscle mass, you increase the numbers of those important mitochondria.
Yep. And your muscle and your brain.
Yep.
I mean, what you're doing for your muscle, you're doing for your heart, you're doing for your brain.
And then the cardio is there to kind of teach those mitochondria how to work more efficiently.
Right.
And they both have a lot of importance. But then, again, you have to be healthy enough to do it. But they found that, so there's this miracle grow for your brain. It's a hormone called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Yeah.
And all exercise will increase it. But the higher intensity stuff increases it more.
Yep.
But you're not.
Either
you don't
HIIT
go from
training,
zero
sprint
to you don't go from 0 to high intensity without kind of getting your build your base up first. But there's some interesting evidence about that higher intensity stuff with
for sure.
With the improvement and those again, the trophic factors, the things that help to build up the brain.
Yeah, protective.
I don't know.
Okay.
But those are probably all the down and dirty and
the down and dirty of it,
how we
right?
think about it. But I think, again, if you're concerned, talk to your primary provider. Consider doing one of these online screening things. I can't remember if they have like the Montreal Cognitive one online, but we have a list of some ones that we have here. Give us a call, because again, we have a lot of the testing that we do falls in this in this thing, and it's, I think, becoming more validated as time goes on.
For sure. Yep. And now, here you can come in and see us at Functional Medicine Associates. I also have that direct primary care option, so you can come and do kind of a subscription plan. You're doing really deep dive into some of this integrative gastroenterology on top of all of this. So we're just kind of throwing that shout out as well.
But this is, I think, sort of the Alzheimer's cognitive decline is both like a sub-interest for both of us,
for sure.
For personal
reasons for both of us.
Yeah.
So, 100%.
So, and again, having been to some Bredesen talks, and both of us are reading his books, and again, Richard Isaacson at Cornell Weill, both these guys I've followed for a long time. I think it's high time that this is, become more in the forefront.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening. We appreciate your guys' time and energy in following us. Be sure to share and like our podcast, give us any comments, and again, send it to your friends and family. We'd love to get this information out to as many people as we can.
And always our shout out to our producer, Brandy at Triple Divide Creative.
Love it.
For trying to rein us in and keep us rolling.
Yep. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye.